6:30 a.m., August 17, 1943. The port of Messina, the easternmost tip of Sicily.
Lieutenant General George S. Patton entered the city like a modern Roman emperor. He checked his watch with evident satisfaction. He had beaten British General Montgomery in the race to the finish line by a matter of hours. Flags waved, military bands played. The American press immediately wired the story home, citing this as proof of the superior speed and power of the United States Army. It was a perfect victory. But less than 3 miles away, across the narrow strait, officers of the German High Command were observing the spectacle through binoculars. They were not trembling. They were not panicking. On the contrary, they were breathing a sigh of relief. While Patton was busy organizing a victory parade to satisfy his ego against the British, German General Hans-Valentin Hube had accomplished the impossible right under his nose. A fragile fleet of ferries, operating for 6 consecutive nights, had successfully transported nearly 40,000 elite troops, thousands of vehicles, and 47 Panzer tanks out of the Sicilian death trap and safely onto the Italian mainland. Patton had captured the terrain on the map, but he had let the soul of the enemy army escape. The Germans could not believe their luck. They had braced themselves for a second Stalingrad, but instead they received a priceless gift from Patton's own hubris. This is not the story of a military victory. This is a forensic profile of the Messina Incident, where a general's ego saved an entire German army group, allowing that phantom force to return and slaughter American soldiers in Italy just months later. Rewind to early August 1943. XIV Panzer Corps Headquarters, northeastern Sicily. Inside a command tent choking on cigarette smoke and volcanic dust, General Hans-Valentin Hube was staring at the tactical map with the eyes of a condemned man. Hube was not a desk general. He was the one-armed man, a survivor who had returned from the hell of Stalingrad. More than anyone, Hube knew the scent of encirclement. And at this moment, every indicator on the map was screaming toward a similar conclusion: a second Stalingrad, right here on the Mediterranean. Theoretically, Hube's army was already the walking dead. In the skies, Allied air power held absolute supremacy. Offshore, the Anglo-American fleets blockaded every route. On the ground, he was caught between the 2 giant pincers of Montgomery and Patton, facing a fire ratio of 10-1. Sicily was a giant funnel, and 40,000 German troops were being squeezed toward its narrowest spout, the port of Messina. If the single road leading there were cut, they would be pinned against the sea wall. No escape. Surrender would be the only option. In emergency meetings with Field Marshal Kesselring, everyone agreed on a nightmare scenario, a move any first-year cadet could see. It was the checkmate via amphibious envelopment. The Americans possessed a massive fleet of landing craft. They did not need to climb over the rugged mountains the Germans were defending. Patton only needed to execute a leapfrog maneuver, land a Marine or infantry division behind the defensive line, cutting Highway 113, the sole artery to Messina. If Patton did that, the lid would slam shut. German coastal gunners had their eyes glued to the horizon 24/7, holding their breath, waiting for the landing ships to appear. That was the death sentence they knew was coming. But then, day after day, reconnaissance reports painted a strange picture. Instead of using the sea to lock the back door, Patton's divisions were attacking frontally. American troops were throwing themselves against the mountain defense systems in the most costly, classical manner possible. What happened next stunned the German staff officers. The reports did not indicate a clever tactical maneuver. They indicated madness.
Patton was charging straight into the barrel of their guns. The Germans' most dangerous enemy was suddenly acting like an amateur. Why was he banging his head against a stone wall instead of walking around it? Why choose the bloodiest path to push the Germans exactly where the Germans wanted to go? Suspicion quickly shifted to disdain mixed with relief. By analyzing radio intercepts and Allied press reports, German intelligence found the final piece of the puzzle, a truth that made Hube find the situation both laughable and unbelievable. Patton did not care about killing German soldiers. He only cared about beating the British. In Patton's mindset at the time, destroying the Panzer Corps was less important than having the American flag fly over the Messina town hall before Montgomery's. Hube's opponent was trapped in a prestige race. He wanted to reach the finish line fastest, not most efficiently. He wanted to clear the map to pave the way for personal glory. At this moment, the fear vanished. Hube realized he was not facing a tactical master intent on his destruction, but a cowboy rushing to the finish line. And Hube decided to clear the lane for that cowboy, but in the German way. As the nature of the game shifted from enemy destruction to territorial acquisition, Patton unwittingly turned his entire 7th Army into hostages of a glory-drunk crusade. At Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's headquarters in Rome, intelligence reports regarding fractures in the Allied command structure were received like a miracle. The Germans did not need to use divide and conquer tactics, because the enemy was dividing itself. The clearest evidence of this chaos lay in the encrypted orders Patton sent down to forward units. Instead of coordinating with the British 8th Army to form a net, Patton issued a shocking directive, an order that military historians would later shake their heads at. He ordered General Omar Bradley, his subordinate, to take Messina at all costs, and most importantly, not to yield the road to any British unit. Patton even directed American reconnaissance that if they saw British troops entering their axis of advance, they were to fire warning shots or blow up bridges to block their allies. Patton's enemy at this moment appeared to no longer be Hube or Kesselring, but Bernard Montgomery.
Für den deutschen Stab war das eine goldene Chance. Im War, der enemy's lack of coordination ist der beste Armor. Hube, mit der scharfen Mind eines Meisters der defensiven Kämpfe, immediately shifted to phase 2 of the withdrawal plan, the rearguard action.
Understanding that Patton craved speed, the Germans designed a route from hell to satisfy that thirst, but at an exorbitant price. The terrain of northeastern Sicily, with its winding, single-track coastal roads, was the perfect stage for this type of warfare. Hube did not deploy his forces for a fair fight. Instead, he broke his divisions into independent combat teams, mobile and ruthless. Every curve, every bridge, every ravine was turned into a fatal choke point. The German formula was simple but devastatingly effective. A well-camouflaged 88mm anti-tank battery, a few MG-42 machine gun nests holding the high ground, and most importantly, combat-engineered demolition teams. Their mission was not to hold land, but to buy time. They waited for the American vanguard to enter the kill zone, opened intense fire to force the enemy to deploy battle formations, call for artillery, and call for air support. And just as the massive American war machine began to spool up to crush the target, the German infantry quietly withdrew, blew the only bridge, and scattered thousands of teller mines across the road surface. Patton used a sledgehammer to swat a fly, and every time the hammer came down, the fly had already flown, leaving only a pile of rubble blocking the American main advance. The waste of war resources reached the pinnacle of absurdity.
After-action reports showed that the Americans dropped thousands of tons of bombs and fired tens of thousands of artillery shells at coordinates that were actually held by only a few German platoons.
At the towns of Troina or San Fratello, Patton threw infantry divisions into bloody frontal assaults lasting days. He believed he was breaking the German spine, but in reality, he was only bashing his head against the hard shell, while the soft body of the beast had slithered away.
From Hube's perspective, Patton's aggression was the very factor that made the retreat run smoother. Continuous attack pressure from the rear created a natural momentum, pushing German units back toward Messina at the desired tempo. If Patton had stopped and circled and cut the road, the Germans would have congested and panicked.
But by pushing continuously from one direction, Patton unwittingly acted as a conveyor belt, transporting the Germans toward the ferry docks systematically.
Patton's greatest tactical blind spot during this phase was his obsession with geographical locations. He measured victory by miles advanced, by the names of captured towns printed in the newspapers the next day. Meanwhile, the Germans measured victory in time. Every hour the Americans were stalled before a blown bridge was a precious hour for German ferries to transport another tank battalion to the opposite bank. Patton captured the ground exactly as he wanted, but it was dead ground, empty towns, scorched, barren hills. The strategic value of these locations was around zero if not accompanied by the destruction of enemy manpower. The irony reached its peak as American forces neared Messina. Their march speed was hailed as godlike. The press heralded Patton as a lightning bolt. But few asked the question, why would a fleeing army allow its pursuer to advance so quickly in the final days? The answer lay in Hube's cold calculation. Once the majority of the main force had crossed the strait safely, he no longer needed to delay Patton for long. Letting Patton advance quickly into the city at this point was actually beneficial, as it would conclude the campaign, preventing the Allies from realizing that the big fish had escaped the net. Patton raced toward the finish line amidst the cheers of his soldiers, believing he was seizing ultimate glory. But in the eyes of the German generals, he looked like an athlete sprinting toward the finish line of a stadium that no longer had an audience. The race Patton exerted all his strength to win was in reality a play for which the enemy had already written the script, happily playing the loser to preserve their forces for the truly important battle waiting ahead. A victory of imagery, but a disaster of strategic efficiency. While Patton was consumed by the prestige race on land, at the Straits of Messina, one of the greatest and most ironic logistical feats of the Second World War was quietly taking place. The Germans named it Operation Lehrgang. There was no panic, no scenes of trampling one another as usually seen in a defeated army. Under the direct command of Colonel Ernst Günther Bade, dubbed the Commander of the Strait, this evacuation operated with the precision of a Swiss watch, right in the eye of the storm. The Strait of Messina, a narrow strip of water less than 4 kilometers wide, separating Sicily from the Italian mainland, transformed into the busiest maritime highway in the world during those 6 fateful nights. The Germans turned a geographical disadvantage into an absolute defensive advantage. Bade established an unprecedentedly dense flak avenue. Hundreds of 88mm and 20mm anti-aircraft batteries and searchlight units were packed along both banks of the strait. The density of anti-aircraft fire was so terrifying that Allied pilots called it the Valley of Death. Any aircraft venturing near the strait at low altitude hit an impenetrable wall of fire. The hesitation of Allied air forces against this net, combined with the Royal Navy's indecision to send warships into the narrow waters, unwittingly created a protective dome for the German ferry fleet. Under that iron dome, the Lehrgang miracle began. Not using massive transport ships that would be easy prey for torpedoes, the Germans utilized a worker ant fleet comprising Siebel ferries, engineer barges, small landing craft, and anything that could float. They moved continuously like shuttles, day and night.
The process was optimized to the extreme. Tank onto the ferry, cross the river, offload, and immediately move into camouflaged positions while the ferry turned around for the next run. Not a single second was wasted. German troop discipline was maintained to the last minute. No one was left behind, not even the military dogs or the staff typewriters. The contrast between the two sides of the battle line at this moment was dripping with irony. In the west, Patton was driving his troops forward amidst the roar of artillery and the clamor of victory, believing he was backing the enemy into a corner. In the east, in calculated silence, the Germans were performing a massive vanishing act. They withdrew in a rolling fashion. The hard outer shell continued to fight defensively to protect the soft inner core that was evacuating. When Patton smashed that shell, the next shell had already retreated to the ferry docks. By the dawn of August 17, 1943, as the first American jeeps roared into the outskirts of Messina, the final German ferry had just left the dock. Colonel Bade was the last man to step onto the boat, after personally inspecting the harbor to ensure nothing remained for the Americans but rubble. And the statistics following this campaign were a slap in the face to Allied strategic planners. In a mere 6 days and nights, right under the nose of the most powerful air and naval force in the world, the Germans had safely transported 39,569 soldiers across the water. But the human count was not the most terrifying part. What made Allied generals shudder later was the amount of equipment preserved. 9,605 vehicles, including trucks, half-tracks, and command cars. 94 heavy artillery pieces, and tons of ammunition. And most importantly, 47 Panzer tanks and self-propelled guns, steel monsters that should have become scrap metal in Sicily, were now safely sitting on Italian soil, refueled and rearmed, ready for the next slaughter. The pinnacle of irony occurred at the exact moment Patton set foot in the Messina town hall. He had won the race against the British. He stood on the podium of glory. American artillery, in a belated drunken stupor of victory, unleashed a barrage onto the opposite shore, and at the last German ships fading into the morning mist. The harmless columns of water rising in the open sea were the perfect visual metaphor for this victory. Patton had exerted total force to capture an empty shell, while the snail, with all its venom and danger intact, had slithered to a new, more fortified home. The Germans did not view the loss of Sicily as a catastrophic defeat. In reports sent to Berlin, Field Marshal Kesselring considered Operation Lehrgang a brilliant tactical victory. They had traded an island with no remaining defensive value for the preservation of an elite army group. To them, Patton was not a conqueror, but an unwitting accomplice. His frontal attack pressure was exactly what helped the Germans concentrate forces toward Messina faster and more neatly. Instead of cutting off and destroying, Patton herded the enemy on to their exact escape route. When the guns fell silent in Sicily, America celebrated a resounding victory. But in the barracks of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, just landed in Italy, German soldiers were cleaning their weapons and looking back at the strait with arrogant smiles. They knew they hadn't lost. They had just moved to a different stadium, where the terrain was even more rugged, and where they would make Patton and the Allies pay back both principal and interest for the mistake made today. Patton's victory at Messina, when dissected under the lens of military efficiency, was in reality just an expensive fireworks display, masking one of the greatest strategic failures of the Allies in the Mediterranean.
The intoxication of victory at Messina evaporated faster than champagne bubbles. As the cheers faded and the newspaper headlines hailing Patton began to yellow, a brutal reality began to take shape on the Italian mainland. War does not forgive mistakes, and history always has a way of collecting debts, down to the last drop of blood. Just months after the raucous celebration in Sicily, Allied forces launched Operation Avalanche, landing on the beaches of Salerno in southern Italy. They hoped for a quick advance on Rome, but instead of a promenade, they stepped into a slaughterhouse.
And the executioners waiting for them there were none other than the phantoms that had escaped death at the Strait of Messina.
American intelligence officers at the front began to recognize chillingly familiar unit designations. It was the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division. It was units of the renowned 1st Parachute Division. It was the Mark IV tanks with 75mm barrels still stained with the dust of Sicily. These units were not a defeated remnant licking their wounds. Thanks to the absolute success of the evacuation campaign, they had been refitted, rested, and most importantly, they carried blood-bought experience regarding how Americans fought. At Salerno, the very tanks Patton had let slip in Sicily led the counterattack that nearly pushed the entire American corps into the sea. If those 47 tanks and hundreds of artillery pieces had been destroyed or captured at Messina, German resistance at Salerno would have been cut in half. But the word "if" does not exist in war.
American soldiers on the landing beaches paid with their lives for the integrity of the German armored force. But the true tragedy, the highest price for Patton's gold trophy, was tallied at Monte Cassino and the Gustav Line. In the winter of 1944, the Apennine Mountains transformed into the Allies' worst nightmare on the Western Front. Field Marshal Kesselring, utilizing the elite forces preserved from Sicily, built a defensive wall considered the most formidable in Europe. And holding those deadly high grounds, once again, were old faces. At Cassino, the German 1st Parachute Division, the Green Devils, turned the ancient monastery on the peak into an impregnable fortress. They were the most professional, most battle-hardened soldiers, and they had retreated in good order across the Strait of Messina under Hube's command. Now, they no longer had to retreat. They stood there, on the high ground, raining bullets down on American soldiers trying to climb the barren slopes. Visualize the irony of military history through two superimposed images. On one side is the image of George Patton standing arrogantly at the Messina docks in August 1943, smiling brightly for press photographers, proud to have reached the finish line hours before the British. On the other side is the image of the military cemetery at Cassino in May 1944, where thousands of American soldiers lie forever beneath white crosses stretching as far as the eye can see. Every MG-42 machine gun round that tore through American formations at Rapido River, every mortar shell that pulverized infantry in the Liri Valley, very likely was transported safely on the ferries at the Strait of Messina that Patton failed to stop. The German soldiers pulling the triggers at Cassino were the very soldiers Patton had pushed away instead of destroying. Für den deutschen Hochkommando war Sizilien eine territoriale Defeate, aber eine Siege in Force Preservation. Sie treteten eine Insel, um Zeit und Manpower zu beien, die Gustav-Linie zu bauen. Tankst du diese 40.000 Elitetruppen, hellte Kesselring die Alliierten in Italien für nächlich 2 mehr Jahre, inflicting over 300,000 casualties on the Anglo-American forces. A trade-off that was far too profitable. The Messina Incident, when viewed from this angle, is no longer a victory. It is a bloody lesson in opportunity cost in warfare. When a general places the goal of conquering a red dot on a map higher than the destruction of the enemy's fighting capability, he is borrowing a massive debt from the future.
Patton borrowed that debt in the summer of 1943 to buy glory for himself, and sadly, he was not the one to pay it back. The ones who had to pay both principal and interest for that mistake were the privates and corporals, falling before the guns of enemies who should have been destroyed long ago.
Patton's ego was satisfied in Sicily, but the price was paid in American blood in Rome.